The house at the edge of Bel Air was a palace of silence. Its wide marble floors echoed with footsteps that never lingered, and its glass walls looked outward to a city that never once looked back. Aria Navarro had grown accustomed to that silence, though it never grew gentle. It was the silence of distance, the silence of absence, the silence of a marriage that existed only on paper. She woke each morning before the sun reached the eastern hills, her hands careful not to disturb anything in the cavernous bedroom she had never truly claimed. At 6 o'clock sharp, she crept down the staircase to the kitchen. There, she poured a modest cup of coffee, ate half a slice of toast, and slipped away before Julian Mercer appeared at 6:15. It was their unspoken arrangement. She would vanish before he entered, and he would act like she had never been there. 3 years of this had carved a routine so sharp it might as well have been etched into the marble itself. She counted fewer than 50 words exchanged in all that time. Marriage vows had been said once in a ceremony that resembled a business meeting more than a promise. And after that, there was nothing. No shared breakfasts, no gentle questions about how the day had gone, no trace of warmth between them. She lived like a shadow. He lived like the sun, distant, blinding, untouchable. But the rhythm faltered on a Tuesday morning that began as quietly as any other. Aria sat at the kitchen island, sipping her coffee in the 15-minute window she had claimed as her own. She had already begun to stand when she heard footsteps descending earlier than usual. Her heart gave a startled thud. He was never early. She turned toward the door and saw him. Julian Mercer in his tailored navy suit, hair perfect, expression unreadable. His blue eyes locked on her and he said her name for the first time in months. Aria. The sound rooted her to the tile. She could not remember when he had last spoken it aloud. She almost answered instinctively, but her throat was tight. Yes, she managed, her voice strained, a mixture of surprise and caution. Do you have something suitable to wear to a corporate event? His tone was clipped, practical, as though he were addressing an assistant rather than his wife. Aria blinked. I do not understand. A dress, something appropriate for you to accompany the CEO of Mercer Capital to a gala dinner tomorrow night. Her breath caught. She had been hidden for 3 years, a wife unseen, a name unmentioned at any public function. Why now? Why are you asking me that? She said, her words edged with a courage she had not known she still possessed. Julian studied her, his gaze sharp, almost assessing. Because you will attend, 7 o'clock. But why? You never… Business reasons, he interrupted, his voice cold and efficient. I must appear as a stable family man. You are my wife, at least on paper. The words cut through her like glass. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her head lifted. And if I do not wish to go? Julian raised one eyebrow, faintly surprised at her defiance. That is not an option. It is your duty. Duty, she repeated, bitterness curling in her voice. Like everything else in my life, for the briefest of moments, something shifted across his features. Regret? Recognition? It vanished so quickly she wondered if she had imagined it. This event is essential, he said. International investors, multi-million-dollar contracts. You need to look presentable. Presentable. Aria's laughter was bitter. Quiet. You do not even know who I am. Julian, 3 years, and you never tried to learn. I know enough. Do you? She stepped closer, her eyes catching fire. Then tell me, what is my favorite color? What did I study before this arrangement? What do I do with the hours you ignore me in this house? He stayed silent, the first crack in his fortress of composure. That is what I thought, she whispered. I will attend your event, Mr. Mercer, but not because it is a duty. I will go because after 3 years of invisibility, I want to see this world you guard so carefully. She left him in the kitchen, her step steady, her head high. Julian remained where she had abandoned him, watching her disappear up the stairs. His gaze lingered not in indifference, but in recognition for the first time. There was a grace in her movements, even in her simple clothes, a dignity he had somehow overlooked or refused to see for 3 long years. Upstairs, Arya sat on the edge of her bed, her pulse unsteady. Tomorrow, she would step out not as a hidden bride but as the wife of Julian Mercer, the most powerful CEO in Los Angeles. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She glanced at the navy dress tucked away in her closet, the only formal piece she had kept from her life before. Would it be enough? Would she be enough? Downstairs, Julian lingered in the silent kitchen. Her defiance, sharp words, and unwavering poise had unsettled him more than any investor's question ever had. He felt something strange stir in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. Why did it matter how she looked at him? Why did her contempt sting so deeply? The next evening, the answer would begin to take shape. But that morning, they stood in separate rooms, bound by a contract, unaware that the first thread of change had already been pulled loose. The house was no longer silent, it was waiting. The Grand Beverly Hotel gleamed like a jewel under chandeliers that scattered light into shards of gold. Arya Navarro stood at the entrance in her navy dress, which she had chosen with hesitation and defiance. The fabric was simple, not the sequined extravagance of Los Angeles high society, but she carried it with dignity. She was not just a shadow in the Mercer mansion for the first time in 3 years. Tonight she would be seen. Julian Mercer was at her side, flawless in a black tuxedo, his expression carved from stone. His hand rested lightly on her back, not tender but declarative, a signal to the world that this woman belonged beside him. Arya felt her pulse quicken as cameras flashed and the hum of voices swelled. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with silk gowns, polished shoes, and the sound of champagne being poured into crystal flutes. The air smelled of money and ambition. Business people laughed too loudly, socialites whispered behind diamond bracelets, and investors scanned the room like predators tracking prey. Julian moved with practiced ease, shaking hands, trading measured smiles, his voice steady and magnetic. When he introduced Arya, the words were formal. "My wife, Arya Navarro Mercer." He said it as though unveiling a strategic asset. Still, the title clung to her skin like a sudden flame. Richard Crawford, a broad-shouldered investor from New York, was the first to greet her. "A pleasure, Mrs. Mercer," he said with a polished bow. "I have been waiting to meet you." Arya's hand trembled faintly in his, but her voice was steady. "The pleasure is mine." Then came Lorenzo Marchetti, the Italian financier with silver hair and a smile that bordered on reckless charm. He lifted her hand and brushed his lips against it. "Enchanté, Madame Mercer. Your husband has been hiding you far too well." Arya blinked, startled. "Hiding me?" Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but Lorenzo continued, oblivious or bold. "Do you speak other languages?" Arya said before Julian could stop her. "French, Spanish, and Italian." "Magnifico. I must confess I have contracts in South America that desperately require someone with precisely your skills. Would you be interested in discussing them?" Julian's hand brushed Arya's arm with a subtle warning. "She does not work," he said flatly. "What a waste," Lorenzo replied, his gaze never leaving Arya's. "A woman this intelligent should not be confined to decoration." Arya felt a thrill, a rush of recognition after years of invisibility. For the first time, someone looked at her not as an ornament, but as a mind. "I would love to help," she answered, quiet but resolute. "Perfect. Tomorrow night? Dinner, and we can discuss the details." Julian's voice sliced through the air. "She is busy." "I am not," Arya said, meeting Julian's icy stare. "I would be delighted, Mr. Marchetti." The Italian smiled broadly. "Excellent. 8 o'clock. I will send the car." Julian's hand clamped around Arya's elbow harder than necessary as he walked away. "What do you think you are doing?" he hissed. "Having a conversation?" Arya replied coolly. "Something you might consider attempting." "You are not having dinner with him. And why not? You said it yourself. I am your wife only on paper. And on paper, I am free to do as I please." Julian's gaze darkened, dangerous, but she pulled her arm free. For the remainder of the night, he did not leave her side. Each time Lorenzo appeared, Julian positioned himself like a sentinel, cold eyes sweeping over anyone who dared to look too long at Aria. The guests noticed. Whispers trailed through the air like perfume. The untouchable CEO suddenly becomes possessive. The hidden wife was suddenly unveiled. Aria played her part with elegance, conversing about markets and literature, offering smiles that reached her eyes even when Julian's grip on her wrist threatened to leave bruises. She felt alive, defiant, untamed. When they left, tension coiled between them like a drawn bowstring. In the car, the silence was suffocating. "You are not meeting him," Julian said at last, his voice low and sharp. "Yes, I am," Aria replied. "Why? To get under your skin?" She turned, her eyes burning. "To remind myself I am a real person, Julian, someone with value, someone you chose to ignore." He stayed silent, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. Aria moved toward the stairs back at the mansion, pausing at the landing. "Thank you for tonight," she said quietly. "It was eye-opening." Julian's voice followed her up the steps, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Aria?" She stopped. "Yes?" He opened his mouth, closed it again, then shook his head. "Nothing. Good night." Aria entered her bedroom with her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had been invisible for 3 years, but the world saw her tonight. More importantly, Julian had seen her as an accessory and a woman who could defy him, attract attention, and his cold, disciplined chest. Downstairs, Julian remained in the living room, still and silent. He replayed every detail, every glance between her and Lorenzo, every smile, every flicker of defiance in her eyes. The image gnawed at him, refusing to let him rest. Why did it matter? Why did her refusal to obey sting more than a lost deal? Why did the thought of another man drawing her away feel like a knife pressing against his ribs? The Grand Beverly had been a battlefield. Neither of them had expected war, but they walked away with wounds. For Julian, it was the first time he realized what it meant to fear losing something. For Aria, it was the first time she realized she had the power to make him bleed. Tomorrow night promised a reckoning. The house was quiet, but inside Aria Navarro's chest, the echoes of the gala still thundered. She had stood in the Grand Beverly beneath chandeliers and eyes that judged, defied Julian Mercer in front of the world, and felt something inside her ignite. It was not merely rebellion. It was the birth of visibility after years of being unseen. She could not sleep that night. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw Lorenzo Marchetti's smile, heard his easy charm, and remembered his hand's warmth as he promised to recognize her mind. More unsettling than that was the image of Julian beside her, stiff and watchful, his gaze a blade at any man who lingered too long. The possessiveness had startled her, not because it frightened her, but because it suggested a pulse beneath the marble exterior. At dawn, Aria abandoned the restless sheets and descended to the kitchen. She poured coffee and sat by the wide window where the first light spilled into the world. For the first time since marriage, she allowed herself to dream of a life not bound to Julian's silence. A life where her voice mattered, where her education was not an afterthought, where she was seen. She did not expect him to appear. Julian's footsteps sounded before 6, breaking the routine that had ruled their mornings for years. He entered the kitchen without a word at first, and when he stopped, he froze as if startled to find her there. She was bathed in the fragile light of dawn, hair loose around her shoulders, her robe dignified but straightforward. "You are awake early," Aria said, not looking up from her cup. He studied her, his voice low. "Why dinner with him?" Her lips curved faintly. "You mean Lorenzo Marchetti?" His jaw tightened. "Yes." Aria set the cup down with deliberate care, "because he offered me what you never did. Attention, respect. The recognition that I exist." The words landed heavily. Julian felt something sharp twist in his chest. He wanted to retort and tell her she was wrong, but he could not. He had ignored her, dismissed her, treated her as furniture. His silence betrayed him. "When was the last time you saw me, Julian? Not as an ornament, not as a duty, but as a person." He could not answer. The truth was unbearable. Aria rose, her posture graceful, her voice steady. "That is what I thought. I will have dinner with him tonight." Julian stepped closer, tension crackling in the air. "You will not." "And why not?" "Because you are my wife." "On paper," she said, her eyes bright with fire. "Only on paper." The phrase sliced him open. He had used it himself, casually, dismissively. Heavy with bitterness, hearing it from her lips was to see his cruelty reflected. Arya walked past him toward the stairs, her chin high. At the door, she paused. "You should learn, Julian, that power built on silence eventually collapses." Her words lingered long after she had gone, and Julian remained rooted in the kitchen. He felt unsteady for the first time in years, as if the foundations beneath him had shifted. The image of Lorenzo leaning toward Arya at the gala tormented him. The sound of her voice cutting through his arrogance burned in his ears. He was not used to this kind of battle. In the world of contracts and mergers, he had always been in control. But this was not about shareholders or investors. This was about a woman who had endured his indifference and had finally refused to remain invisible. Julian paced the length of the kitchen, his reflection fractured in the glass windows. Why did it matter if she dined with another man? Why did the thought of her laughter across a table from Lorenzo make his blood run hot with fury? Jealousy. The word rose unbidden, a truth he had never allowed himself to admit. Jealousy was for men who cared, men who loved. He was not supposed to be one of them. And yet, here it was, raw and undeniable, clawing at his composure. Upstairs, Arya stood before the mirror in her room. She touched her reflection, studying the faint tremor of her lips, the defiance in her eyes. For 3 years, she had been little more than a phantom in this house, drifting through its corridors without a voice. But last night, the world had seen her. Tonight, she would be seen again. The clock ticked toward inevitability. Julian remained downstairs, the coffee in his cup long cold, his thoughts darker still. Something had shifted between them, something he did not yet understand. But he knew one thing, with terrifying clarity. He could not allow another man to claim what he had ignored. As the sun rose higher over the city, they prepared for a day that would test the boundaries of their fragile arrangement. For Arya, it was a chance to reclaim her identity. For Julian, it was the first time he understood that indifference was no longer possible. The line had been crossed. Dawn had seen it. Now the rest of the day would decide whether that line marked the beginning of war or the first step toward something neither dared to name. The restaurant was a cathedral of polished wood and soft candlelight, where whispers floated like incense and every glass of wine gleamed like liquid ruby. Arya Navarro sat across from Lorenzo Marchetti, her emerald earrings catching the glow of the chandeliers. She had chosen her dress carefully, not ostentatious but striking. A quiet proclamation that she was more than an accessory. For the first time in years, she felt like herself. She was not the paper bride hidden behind Mercer gates, not the silent figure at the edge of Julian's empire. Here, with Lorenzo, she was Arya again, the woman who had once dreamed of negotiating contracts across continents and had studied markets late into the night with relentless determination. Lorenzo leaned forward, his voice warm, tinged with admiration. "Tell me about your work before the marriage. I cannot imagine you as anything but brilliant in a boardroom." Arya smiled faintly, though pain lingered in the curve of her lips. "I was a consultant. Emerging markets, international strategies. I loved it. But that part of me was buried the day I signed my name on a marriage contract." "What a loss," he murmured, shaking his head. "The world deserves the mind I see in your eyes." Her heart stirred at his words, at being seen. It was dangerous, intoxicating. She allowed herself to forget the shadows trailing her momentarily, to imagine she could step into this life freely. But she was not free. The air shifted suddenly, like a storm cloud rolling through. Arya felt it before she saw him. Julian Mercer entered the restaurant, his presence sharp as the cut of his tailored suit. His eyes swept the room, found her, and locked with a force that made her breath falter. "Julian," she whispered under her breath, half in disbelief, half in dread. He strode to their table with the authority of a man used to owning every space he entered. Lorenzo rose, extending his hand with a polite greeting. "What a surprise. Care to join us?" Julian's gaze never left Arya. He said flatly, pulling out a chair without waiting for permission. Arya's pulse thundered. This was no accident. He had followed her, intruded on a space she had carved for herself. Anger burned in her chest, but beneath it was something far more dangerous, a flicker of anticipation. For a few moments they sat in tense silence. Lorenzo attempted civility, speaking of markets and opportunities in Chile and Argentina. But Julian's responses were clipped, his attention fixed wholly on Aria. The candles flickered between them, like a line of fire neither could cross without burning. Finally, Aria broke the silence. "You should not be here. Neither should you," Julian replied, his voice low but edged. "I told you I was coming. I told you I needed to be seen." "By him," Julian snapped, his eyes flashing toward Lorenzo. "By anyone," she said fiercely. "By someone." The words cracked something inside him. He leaned forward, his voice raw. "You are my wife." She whispered on paper, the old refrain that had become shield and weapon. Julian's hands clenched on the table, his composure unraveling. "And what if I say that is no longer enough?" Aria blinked, startled by the intensity in his voice. "What are you saying? That I see you now? I cannot stop seeing you." Lorenzo glanced between them, sensing the gravity of a storm he did not belong to. "Let's give you two a moment." He rose and excused himself, leaving them alone with the weight of unsaid truths. The silence that followed was heavy, charged, almost unbearable. Aria searched Julian's face, looking for a sign of sincerity, of vulnerability. For 3 years, she had begged silently for this recognition, and now that it came, she did not know if she could believe it. She said quietly that you cannot rewrite 3 years in a single night. "I can try," Julian replied, his voice low, desperate. Her eyes shimmered, torn between fury and longing. "And what if I do not let you? Then I will fight until you do." The words hung in the air like a vow, trembling with the weight of everything left unsaid. When Lorenzo returned, the storm between them had not passed, only deepened. He glanced at Aria and Julian and smiled faintly, a man wise enough to know he had witnessed the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. The evening ended with no resolution, only questions. But as they entered the night, the city lights reflecting in their eyes, one truth burned through the uncertainty. The lines had shifted. The roles they had played for 3 years could no longer hold. At the table for two, a war had begun. Not between rivals, but between silence and recognition, between indifference and desire. And for the first time, Julian Mercer feared that he might lose a battle that mattered more than any fortune he had ever built. The mansion felt heavier than usual the morning after the confrontation at the restaurant. Aria Navarro lingered in her room, staring at the emerald dress she had worn, as though it carried a secret message. She had returned late, her heart a battlefield of anger and confusion, and Julian Mercer had not followed her, yet his presence pressed on her even in his absence, like a shadow that refused to dissolve. She stood before the mirror, fingers brushing her reflection. Who was she now? A wife on paper, or a woman awakening to a truth she could not yet name? Last night had not given her clarity. It had given her questions that refused to be silenced. When she descended to the kitchen, she expected silence. Instead, she found Julian already there. He stood at the stove, a sight so alien it rooted her to the doorway. The CEO who commanded boardrooms with an iron gaze now flipped pancakes surprisingly. "Good morning," he said, turning toward her. Aria blinked. "You cook." "I learned in college," he replied simply. "Nothing fancy, but edible." She remained still, suspicious. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I want to start over, for real this time." He gestured to the counter, where he had set 2 plates, fresh fruit arranged carefully beside steaming mugs of coffee. The gesture was ordinary, yet extraordinary. It was the first time he had invited her to sit at the table with him in 3 years. Hesitant, she obeyed curiosity more than trust and sat. He placed the pancakes in front of her with care. "Thank you," she murmured. "How did you sleep?" Julian asked. Her fork paused. "Excuse me, how was your night? Did you rest well?" The human and straightforward question struck her as absurd coming from him. "You are actually asking me how I slept?" "Yes, and I plan to keep asking." Aria studied him, searching for mockery, for strategy. Instead, she found something she had never noticed in his face before: vulnerability. "And if I say it is too late," she whispered, "then I will prove you wrong, Julian said, his voice steady but not arrogant. The words startled her, not because they were bold, but because they rang with a truth she had not expected from him. The day unfolded strangely. Julian canceled his usual schedule, spending the afternoon in the library instead of his office. At lunch, he appeared with takeout from a Thai restaurant she had mentioned liking years ago. He asked her about her favorite books, ambitions, and dreams at dinner. He listened, really listened. Arya felt disoriented. This was not the man she had endured for 3 years. This was someone else, someone new, someone dangerous in his sincerity. On the third night, she found him in the living room reading a book. No laptop, no phone pressed to his ear, just a man in silence, waiting. The door to his office was left open, as though he wanted her to know she could walk in if she wished. He is really trying, she whispered to herself, watching from the staircase. The question was, did she dare believe him? Julian, too, wrestled with questions. He paced his study at night, haunted by the image of Lorenzo's hand on Arya's, by her voice telling him she was only his wife on paper. For the first time in years, contracts and profits seemed meaningless. For the first time in his life, something mattered more than winning deals. Arya began to notice changes in herself. She looked forward to breakfast, hearing what he would ask, and wondering if he would remember the small details she had revealed. She caught herself watching him when he was not looking, startled by the warmth in his eyes when they met hers. Yet caution clung to her. A few days of gestures could not erase 3 years of indifference. She feared this was a phase, a performance, a strategy to reclaim what he believed was his. One evening, as they sat in the garden watching the sunset, she broke the silence. Why now, Julian? Why try after 3 years? He turned toward her, his eyes unguarded. Because I finally saw what I had almost lost. Her breath caught. Because I realized you are extraordinary and was too blind to notice. The words settled between them like fragile glass. Arya wanted to believe them, but pain still shadowed her. She rose, her heart unsteady. I need time, she said softly. 3 years do not vanish overnight. Julian stood as well, but he did not press. I will give you all the time you need, but know this, Arya, I will not give up. Not this time. She walked back into the mansion, her thoughts in a storm. For the first time in 3 years, she was not invisible. For the first time, she felt the possibility of being seen. And Julian Mercer, once the coldest man she had ever known, now stood at the door of her heart, knocking with a persistence that terrified her more than his indifference ever had. The first crack had opened, and through it light poured. But light could burn as easily as it could heal. The evening air carried the scent of orange blossoms drifting through the vast garden. But inside the Mercer mansion, the air was thick with unsaid truths. Arya Navarro sat in the library with a book on her lap, though her eyes had not moved across the page for nearly an hour. Her thoughts circled back to the past, to the day her parents had sat her down in their modest dining room and shattered the future she had dreamed. She remembered the way her mother's hands trembled, the way her father paced the floor with guilt stamped across his face. They had $2 million in debt. They had said that their small firm was crumbling under bad partnerships. The Anderson family, powerful and relentless, had made an offer. They would save the Navarros from ruin, but the price would be Arya. That night had branded her. She had agreed because what choice had she been given? And now, 3 years later, she sat in a mansion gilded with silence, married to a man who treated her as an obligation, until the day jealousy tore through his indifference. Julian Mercer entered the library quietly. For once, he was not wearing his armor of a suit. His sleeves were rolled, his expression unguarded. He paused when he saw her, as if measuring whether to approach or retreat. "You are still awake," he said at last. "I could not sleep," Arya replied without looking up. "Neither could I." The silence stretched, fragile. Finally, Arya closed the book and met his gaze. "Why now, Julian? Why are you suddenly trying after 3 years of nothing?" He drew a breath, heavy with words unsaid. "Because I finally realized what I had. Because I saw another man look at you. It broke something inside me. Her eyes narrowed. "So it took jealousy to remind you that I am alive." "It took jealousy," he admitted, "but also shame. Shame that I let 3 years pass without knowing the color of your eyes in the morning light." Arya studied him, torn between disbelief and the flicker of something dangerously like hope. "And if I say it is too late, then I will spend the rest of my life proving you wrong." The vulnerability in his voice disarmed her. For the first time, she saw him not as the untouchable CEO, but as a man fumbling in the dark, trying to find his way back. She rose from her chair, her eyes shining. "You want to understand, then hear the truth." Julian nodded, bracing himself. 3 years ago," she began, "my parents told me about the debts. $2 million gone. Our home, our firm, everything is collapsing. They said your father offered to save us, but there was a price, me." Julian's chest tightened. "I did not know the details," he whispered. "Of course you did not. You never asked. You were getting a convenient wife. I was getting chains disguised as vows." He stepped closer, guilt burning in his eyes. "I cannot undo the past, Arya, but I can change the future." "Can you?" she challenged, her voice trembling. "Or is this just another strategy to secure what your family wanted?" "It is not a strategy," he said fiercely. "It is the first honest thing I have ever felt." Her breath hitched. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the ghosts of the past heavy between them. Finally, Arya spoke, her voice soft but cutting. "You want a chance, then earn it, not with gestures or words, but with truth." Julian swallowed hard, his eyes locked on hers. "I will, whatever it takes." She walked past him toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back. "Then be ready, because truth costs more than money." Julian remained in the library when she was gone, the fire casting shadows across his face. For the first time in his life, he understood the cost of the bridge that had carried him to power. It had been built with her freedom, her dreams, her dignity, and if he wanted to cross it again, he would have to pay a price far greater than any deal he had ever signed. The price of redemption. The price of love. The morning after her confession weighed heavily on the mansion. Arya Navarro moved through the halls with the quiet of a woman who had laid bare wounds too deep for bandages. The night before she had told Julian Mercer the truth of their marriage. The bargain struck with her freedom. The chains disguised as vows. And though the telling had cut her open, it had loosened something inside her. For the first time she was not carrying it alone. Julian emerged from his study late in the morning, his face drawn but resolute. He had not slept. She could see it in the red rims of his eyes, his jaw clenched as if he were holding back a tide. He stopped when he saw her, standing in the sunlit corridor as though caught between approaching or retreating. "You said I must earn it," he said, his voice rough. "Then let me start now." Arya lifted her chin. "Words are not enough." "Then watch me," Julian replied. He began with small things. Flowers appeared in her room, not the sterile roses sent by secretaries, but wild white lilies, the kind she had once said reminded her of home. He canceled meetings to share dinner with her, fumbling with recipes until the smoke alarm howled, and they laughed despite themselves. He asked her about the books she read and listened as though every page mattered. Arya tried to resist. She told herself it was too late, that his sudden change was a performance. Yet her heart betrayed her. Each time he reached for her hand, each time his eyes softened when she entered the room, she felt the ice around her thaw a little more. One evening, as the sky melted into shades of gold, Julian brought her to the terrace overlooking the city. The view stretched vast, glittering, endless. He stood beside her, silent at first, then spoke with a rawness she had never heard from him. "I do not know how to love, Arya. No one ever taught me. I was raised on contracts, ledgers, and the idea that affection makes you weak. But when I saw you slipping away, when I saw him looking at you, I realized I was already weak without you." Arya's heart twisted. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let the sincerity in his words wash away 3 years of neglect, but she was still afraid. She turned to him, her eyes shimmering. "If you want me to believe you, Julian, then do not just tell me. Show me every day. Show me until I cannot deny it anymore." His hand rose, hesitant, and brushed her cheek. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice trembling with restraint. Arya's breath caught. She had been untouched for 3 years, a bride in name only. The heat of his palm against her skin was a spark threatening to ignite a fire she had long buried. But instead of answering, she stepped back, her heart pounding. Not yet. Julian's hand fell. His eyes held disappointment, but also respect. Then I will wait, however long it takes. The days turned into weeks. Slowly, carefully, their world shifted. They began to share breakfasts, sometimes lingering with coffee long after the sun had risen. She told him stories of her childhood, the summers she spent chasing waves along the coast, and the nights she and her father stayed up building puzzles until dawn. He told her about the suffocating pressure of being Charles Mercer's son, about how every smile was weighed, every word measured, every mistake magnified. Piece by piece, the walls crumbled. Then, one evening, it happened. They were in the kitchen again, the same place where their new beginning had quietly started. Julian had been attempting a pasta dish, sauce splattering across the counter, and Arya laughed so hard tears sprang to her eyes. She reached to wipe a streak of tomato from his cheek, and he caught her hand, holding it against his face. Their eyes met, the air stilled. Julian's voice was a whisper, "May I?" Arya's heart pounded, but she did not pull away. His lips found hers gently, hesitantly, afraid she might vanish. The kiss was not one of conquest, but of reverence, of apology, of a man learning the language of love for the first time. Arya melted into him, her arms circling his neck, her soul aching with release. For the first time, their marriage was not paper, duty, or debt. It was real. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Arya rested her forehead against his. "This does not erase the past," she murmured. "I do not want it to," Julian replied. "I only want to build a future with you." And for the first time since the day she signed away her freedom, Arya believed that maybe, just maybe, that future was possible. The marriage that had begun as a transaction had finally taken its first step toward becoming a bond. Not of paper, not of obligation, but of love. The mansion had grown warmer in recent weeks. What had once been a palace of silence now carried the faint echo of laughter, the rhythm of two people learning to breathe in the same air. Arya Navarro had begun to believe that the walls might finally release their grip on her, that the life she had resigned herself to could be reshaped into something living, something true. But trust is fragile, and when born from ashes, love demands fire to test its strength. It was a rainy afternoon when Arya wandered into Julian's study. He had left early for a meeting, his desk unusually untidy, papers scattered as though abandoned in haste. She had not intended to snoop, she only meant to organize the chaos. Yet fate can place the truth where it should never be found. Her eyes caught the edge of a leather folder, half hidden beneath a pile of reports. Something about its placement drew her hand. She pulled it free, expecting contracts or financial forecasts. What she found made her breath falter. Inside were documents dated the week of their wedding, contracts outlining mergers between Mercer Capital and the Navarro family firm. Clauses describing not just financial arrangements, but stipulations for public appearances. Clauses about heirs, about 5-year obligations, about the optics of stability. Her name was there, not as a signature, but as a condition, Arya Navarro Mercer. Woven into balance sheets, tied to capitalization tables, reduced to an asset line in a corporate strategy. The room spun. For 3 years, she had lived with the suspicion that she was nothing more than a pawn, and here was the proof written in black ink. When Julian entered the study hours later, rain still clinging to his coat, he found her standing rigid by the desk, the folder open before her. "Arya," he began carefully. "Explain," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut. Julian's eyes dropped to the folder. His shoulders stiffened. "It is not what it looks like. My life was written into a contract before I spoke my vows." Julian moved closer, his voice low, pleading. "Yes, I knew of the merger, but did not see every clause. My father handled much of it. I swear I never saw those details." Her laughter was bitter. "You expect me to believe that? You, who notices every decimal on every page, missed this." His silence betrayed him. Arya's chest heaved, fury and heartbreak colliding. And all these weeks you've been playing at redemption, flowers and dinners, while this sat hidden in your drawer. Julian stepped forward, desperation breaking through his composure. What I feel for you now is not on paper. It is real. It has nothing to do with those contracts. She shook her head, tears burning her eyes. Then prove it. Prove that your love can survive the fire that forged our beginning. Julian's hand reached for hers, but she pulled away, her voice trembling. Until then, I cannot stay here. She left the folder open on his desk, her footsteps echoing through the halls. Within the hour, she had packed a small bag and walked out into the storm. The mansion that had begun to feel like a home collapsing into a prison of marble and glass. Julian stood in the study, long after she was gone, staring at the words that had condemned him. He hated the ink, the paper, and himself for the truth it revealed. For the first time in his life, Julian Mercer had no deal to close, no contract to shield him. All he had was the echo of Aria's words, haunting and absolute. Prove it. And he knew that nothing less than everything he was would be enough. The hotel room was quiet, except for the low hum of the air conditioner. Aria sat by the window, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Outside, the city moved with its usual indifference, but a storm raged louder within her chest than the traffic below. She had replayed the discovery of those contracts 100 times in her mind. Each time, she saw herself standing in Julian's study, folder in hand, watching his face pale. Each time, she felt the same sharp stab of betrayal. Love might have blossomed in recent weeks, but beneath it lay poisoned soil, and she wondered if any flower could survive in ground so corrupted. The days dragged into a week. Julian called, messaged, and even sent flowers to the hotel. But Aria had refused them all. She needed distance. She needed to breathe without his presence clouding her thoughts. And yet, every night she found herself staring at the ceiling, wondering what he was doing, whether he was pacing the halls of that empty mansion, or sitting at his desk, haunted by the same silence that now consumed her. On the 7th day, nausea struck her without warning. She rushed to the bathroom, clinging to the sink until the wave passed. Dazed, she sat on the cool tiles, pressing a trembling hand to her stomach. Memories flashed, late mornings when she had felt more tired than usual, afternoons when dizziness had forced her to sit. She had dismissed them as stress. But now, a different possibility loomed. Aria bought 3 pregnancy tests from the pharmacy down the street, her hands shaking as she placed them on the counter. Back at the hotel, she lined them up on the sink and waited through the longest minutes of her life. Positive, positive, positive. She sank to the floor, the tests clattering from her grip. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not of joy or despair alone, but of a terrifying mixture of both. She was carrying Julian's child. She sat silently for hours, trying to comprehend what this meant. Could she raise a child in the ruins of a marriage built on contracts and lies? Could she trust Julian to be more than the man whose name had been inked beside hers on a balance sheet? By evening, she found herself dialing his number, her heart hammering. She couldn't call, but she typed a message instead. "I need to talk to you, it's important." His reply came within seconds. "Where?" She hesitated, then typed the only place that felt right. "Our room at home, 1 hour." Aria stood in the hotel room, staring at the packed suitcase in the corner. She had left the mansion in anger, but now she would return with news that could not be carried in silence. She would no longer bear it alone, whether the truth healed or destroyed them. When the Porsche pulled into the driveway, she was already inside, sitting on the edge of the bed they had once begun to share. Julian entered moments later, his face weary, but his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "You came back," he whispered. Aria tried to speak, but her voice broke. Tears spilled before she could stop them. Julian instantly crossed the room, his hands hovering, but not daring to touch. "Tell me," he pleaded. "Please, Aria, whatever it is, we'll face it." Her hand reached into her purse. She pulled out the 3 tests and laid them on the bed between them. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely audible. For a long moment, Julian said nothing, his eyes locked on the tests, as though they were written in a language he struggled to understand. Then slowly, almost reverently, he looked up at her, his blue eyes shimmering with something she had never seen before: fear, hope, awe. "Pregnant," he repeated. Yes, the word hung in the air like a promise and a threat. Julian's composure cracked. He reached for her, tears spilling unchecked. Arya felt his arms around her, his lips pressing to her hair. "I love you," he whispered fiercely. "I love this child. I love you both more than anything in this world." Arya closed her eyes, letting herself sink into his embrace. But even as her heart ached with relief, a deep voice whispered the question she could not silence. Was love enough to erase the weight of silence, the ink of betrayal, the years lost to indifference? The answer was still uncertain, and their future would depend on whether Julian could truly prove that this time nothing, no contract, no deal, no ambition, would matter more than the family growing within her. The mansion had never felt so fragile. Its towering walls and crystal chandeliers had once represented security, a fortress of power and privilege. But to Julian Mercer, each corner now whispered accusations, and each hallway echoed the footsteps of the woman he feared would lose forever. He had told Arya that her worth eclipsed fortune, that she mattered more than any empire he could build. But words were not enough. Words had built contracts. Words had bound her life to his against her will. If he wanted to prove that love now outweighed ambition, he needed more than promises. He needed a sacrifice. The boardroom was a battlefield. His father sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, surrounded by lawyers in tailored suits. Their voices dripped with numbers, clauses, and profit margins. They did not speak of love or redemption. They spoke of assets and liabilities, as if human lives could be reduced to ledger entries. Julian placed a folder on the table. It contained his decision, his rebellion. "I want to undo the merger with Navarro Accounting," he said firmly. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the uproar. His father slammed a fist against the table. "You've lost your mind. That merger secured $15 million in assets. Our reputation, our growth, our expansion." "Enough," Julian interrupted, his voice steely. "This is not negotiable." One of the lawyers adjusted his glasses nervously. "Technically, Mr. Mercer can dissolve the merger, but the cost will be astronomical. Legal fees, settlements, penalties." "I don't care," Julian cut in. "Do it." His father's face darkened with rage. "You are throwing away everything we built for a woman who doesn't even want to be in this family." Julian stood, his blue eyes blazing. "For once, I chose something that isn't measured in profit. I am choosing my wife." The room erupted again, but Julian no longer listened. For 32 years he had been his father's son, molded into a man of cold efficiency, trained to believe that love was weakness. But now, with Arya's child growing within her, he knew the truth. Love was the only strength worth having. He walked out of the boardroom with the contract under his arm and resolve burning in his chest. The cost no longer mattered. Only Arya did. Meanwhile, across the city, Arya sat in her parents' modest living room. Sarah Navarro wrung her hands nervously while David stared into his coffee cup, shame etched across his face. They had been the architects of her fate, who had agreed to trade her future for financial survival. "You should have told me," Arya said quietly. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "We thought we were saving you, Arya. We didn't know how blind we were." David looked up, his voice heavy with guilt. "We failed you as parents." Arya shook her head. "You saved yourselves, not me. I was just the price." The silence between them was suffocating, until the doorbell rang. When Sarah opened it, Julian stood there, rain dripping from his coat, determination hardening his features. "Arya," he said, stepping into the room, "I need you to hear me." She looked at him with guarded eyes, her arms instinctively wrapping around her stomach. "I gave it back," he said simply. She frowned. "Gave what back?" "The company, the merger. It's over. Your family owns Navarro Accounting again." David's eyes widened. "That's impossible. It would cost millions." Julian nodded. 15 to be exact. "But it's done." Arya stared at him, her mind racing. "Why?" "Because you told me to prove it. I will spend the rest of my life proving that you mean more to me than every dollar I could ever make." For the first time, his voice broke. I love you, Arya. Not on paper, not for appearances, not because of some contract. I love you, the woman, the mother of my child, the only person who ever made me see who I could be." Her heart pounded. She wanted to believe him. She tried to run into his arms and let the world disappear. But scars are not erased in a single gesture, no matter how grand. Her eyes softened, but her words remained firm. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Julian." "Then don't," he whispered. "Not yet. But don't shut me out. Let me fight for us, for you, for our child." The room was heavy with silence, her parents watching quietly as Arya faced the man who had been both her captor and her salvation. She took a slow breath. "One step at a time, Julian. That's all I can give you." His lips curved into the faintest smile, as if a door had opened where he feared only walls. "That's all I ask." In that moment, under the weight of silence and the fragile spark of hope, their battle for redemption truly began. The following weeks unfolded like a fragile dance, each step cautious, each glance weighted with unspoken questions. Arya had agreed to let Julian fight for them, but forgiveness remained distant, like a shore barely visible across a restless sea. She stayed in the mansion, but kept her own room, the child within her demanding rest while her heart demanded space. Julian honored her boundaries, no longer pressing with declarations or grand gestures. Instead, he filled the silence with small acts, a cup of tea left steaming on her bedside table, meetings canceled so he could walk with her in the garden, quiet dinners where he asked about her day and truly listened. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls she had built began to tremble. Yet trust, once broken, is not so easily mended. One evening, Arya found herself awake long after midnight. The storm outside lashed against the windows, and the child stirred restlessly in her womb. Unable to sleep, she wandered down the hall toward Julian's study. The door was ajar, light spilling into the corridor. Inside, Julian sat at his desk, head in his hands, papers scattered across the surface. His phone buzzed with messages he did not answer. For the first time, Arya saw not the powerful CEO, but a man weighed down by the cost of his redemption. She lingered at the doorway, torn between entering and retreating. Julian looked up then, his eyes meeting hers. The exhaustion etched into his features softened as he saw her, but guilt remained in his gaze. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly. "Neither could you," she replied, stepping inside. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit, please." Arya hesitated but obeyed, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach as she lowered herself into the seat. Julian leaned back, his voice low. "The board is furious. My father calls me reckless. The lawyers say I've thrown away an empire. And what do you say?" Julian's eyes held hers. "I say none of it matters if I don't have you." Her heart trembled at the rawness of his words, but she forced herself to remain composed. "You can't erase the past so easily. I know. That's why I'm not asking you to erase it. I'm asking you to let me build something new with you." Silence reigned between them for a moment, broken only by the storm. Then Arya's lips parted with words she had not meant to speak. "I'm afraid, Julian." His expression softened. "Of me?" "Of us," she whispered, "of hoping again and being crushed when the old Julian returns." Julian reached across the desk, his hand hovering before hers. "May I?" After a long pause, she placed her hand in his. His touch was warm, steady, and trembling all at once. "I won't become that man again," he vowed. "Not for my father, not for money, not for anything. You and this child are my world now." Arya's eyes glistened. "If you break this vow, Julian, it will shatter me completely." He squeezed her hand, his own voice breaking. "Then I will guard it with everything I am." That night, something fragile yet undeniable shifted between them. The storm outside raged, but within the study, amidst the remnants of broken contracts and torn pride, a new vow was forged. Not of duty or business, but of love desperately clinging to survival. Still, beneath the warmth of his words, a shadow lingered. For in matters of love and power, the past has a way of returning when least expected, demanding a price neither of them yet understood. The spring sun spilled golden light across the gardens of the Mercer estate, but inside the great hall, anticipation buzzed louder than the hum of bees. Rows of white roses lined the aisle, their fragrance filling the air with sweetness and promise. Guests whispered among themselves, marveling at the transformation they witnessed. The cold mansion that had once been a cage now shone like a sanctuary, prepared for vows born not of duty but of love. Arya stood before the mirror in her bridal gown, her hand resting gently on the swell of her belly. 6 months had passed since she had told Julian about the child. 6 months of trial and slow healing. The wounds of betrayal had not vanished, but Julian had fought for her every day, fought with patience, humility, and a devotion that startled even him. Her parents had returned to the fold of her life, humbled and quieter now, grateful for the second chance Julian's sacrifice had afforded them. The company they had once bartered her future for was back in their hands, thriving under David's steady leadership. For the first time in years, her family's laughter carried no trace of desperation. Arya's maid adjusted the veil, tears glistening in her eyes. "You look radiant, Mrs. Mercer." Arya's lips curved into a small smile. "This time, I finally feel like one." Outside, Julian stood at the altar, his heart pounding harder than any boardroom negotiation had ever made it. His tuxedo was flawless, his hair perfect, but his hands trembled as he held the ring symbolizing not contracts but freedom, not arrangements but choice. When the music swelled, Arya stepped into the garden. Every eye turned, but Julian saw only her, his breath caught, his chest aching with the force of emotion. She moved slowly, every step a declaration that she had chosen to walk toward him, not because she must, but because she wanted to. The officiant's voice rang clear. "We are gathered here today, not to bind two people in obligation, but to renew vows forged in truth." Julian's hands shook as he took hers. "Arya, 3 years ago, I married you without understanding love. I treated you as a shadow, and will regret those years for the rest of my life, but you taught me that love is not weakness. It is the only strength worth having. Today I vow to honor you, cherish you, protect you, and never again allow silence between us." Tears streamed down Arya's face as she spoke. "Julian, I stood in this same garden 3 years ago and gave myself to a man who did not see me. Today, I stand before a man who finally does. You broke me, yes, but you also fought to rebuild me. And now, with our child within me, I vow to trust, forgive, and believe in the love we've both fought so hard to earn." The rings slid onto their fingers, not as symbols of chains, but of choice. The officiant's voice trembled with emotion. "What was once written in contracts is now written in hearts. You may kiss your bride." Julian leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a tender yet fierce kiss, a seal on a bond no paper could hold. The guests erupted in applause, but Arya heard only the steady beat of Julian's heart against hers. Months later, their son was born. David Julian Mercer entered the world with his father's piercing eyes and his mother's gentle smile. As Julian cradled the tiny life against his chest, he whispered through tears, "You will never know a loveless home." Arya watched, exhaustion and joy mingling in her gaze. Their journey had been forged in fire, their marriage tested by lies and salvaged by truth. They had lost years, but in that moment, she knew they had gained something greater, a real family. 1 year passed, and a modest office in downtown Los Angeles bore a new sign, Navarro and Mercer International Consulting. Arya handled emerging markets with the brilliance that had once gone ignored. Julian guided strategy, no longer as a ruler, but as a partner. Their firm was small compared to Mercer Capital, but it was theirs, born of choice, grown from resilience. As they closed the office one evening, Arya paused at the doorway, watching her husband pack files while their son cooed in his bassinet nearby. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. Julian looked up, confused. "Giving up everything?" Julian crossed the room, wrapping his arms around her. "Never. Because in losing everything, I found you." Arya smiled, tears shining in her eyes, then leaned into him, whispering the truth she had carried for so long. "I love you, Julian Mercer." And for the first time, there was no shadow of doubt, no hesitation, only the quiet certainty that their love, battered and bruised, had endured and had become unbreakable. Their story was no longer one of contracts and cages. It was a story of redemption, of vows shattered and remade, of a family forged not by obligation, but by the fiercest fire. Love.